What defines art? Throughout these lectures, I've been using the term art broadly to cover a range of activities, from Jim Lee's drawing a page of Batman to Shakespeare's company printing his plays after his death, from the stories of the Holocaust to the stories of Donald Duck. In this, I seek to recognize a number of creative endeavors as legitimate forms of the human imagination. I run the risk, however, of failing to define my terms, and so of appearing confused about the differences between high art, fine art, literature, popular art, and commercial entertainment that is not traditionally considered art at all. I want to be clear. What defines art, and particularly what defines literature, is the university system. It has long been the responsibility of the university system to define what constitutes art and legitimize it by bestowing it with authority. In this case, the university is the father of art. For a long time, excluded from the university curriculum, comics were considered, like so-called genre fiction, science fiction, crime, mystery, and fantasy, even film, simply and merely commercial entertainment. More recently, as graphic novels, comics have won major awards outside of the university system, and original comic art has been included in gallery and museum exhibitions. Universities have caught up by catching on, largely because English departments have a long-standing tradition of non-interference, allowing instructors to teach what they like, to experiment in the classroom. But comics largely develop their authority through channels of influence that I have described as outside of the university system. If comics are art, they are art because they have made themselves art by refusing to go away, regardless of what the university father concludes. Still, traditionally the university system and secondarily the market for art defines art and literature. The reason this is so is because the university has traditionally been vested with intellectual authority. This is what Bruce Bechtel creates in his own private library. Authority. Alison Bechtel illustrates his library on page 60. For anyone but the landed gentry to refer to a room in their house as the library might seem affected, but there really was no other word for it. Flocked, gilt, velvet, Don Quixote, Mephistopheles, and if my father liked to imagine himself as a 19th century aristocrat overseeing his estate from behind the leather-topped mahogany and brass Second Empire desk, did that really require such a leap of the imagination? Perhaps affectation can be so thoroughgoing, so authentic in its details, that it stops being pretense and becomes, for all practical purposes, real. The details of a library are, of course, the books of literature, and Bruce is quite a reader. Here, these books are actually hidden from view. What we see instead is the material elements, the trappings that define financial authority, and a sophisticated taste in a certain literary style. Gilt, flock, velvet, statuary, a Tiffany lamp. In fact, what the library does is suggest an interplay, a loose and fluid imaginative connection between the invisible and ephemeral authority of literature and a set of material trappings associated with a certain class, what Bechtel here calls the landed gentry. Still, Bruce is quite a reader. Bruce's particular choice of reading is modernism, literary or high modernism, the period of avant-garde writing between 1890 and 1946, and his writers of choice seem to be Henry James, James Joyce, Albert Camus, William Faulkner, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Ernest Hemingway. Great writers, all of them. These writers were all concerned with investigating the individual's interior consciousness set against the social contract that they found to be hypocritical and inapplicable in the face of the world wars of the 20th century. Bruce's library is about fiction, then, in two ways. It is about housing the fiction that Bruce reads and teaches, and it is about creating a fiction for his life. Indeed, it would pull these two senses close. In this, it is a very tangible expression of who Bruce Bechtel is, for he lives a life of fiction. As Bechtel writes here, this fiction colors her own life. I employ these allusions to James and Fitzgerald not only as descriptive devices, but because my parents are most real to me in fictional terms, and perhaps my cool aesthetic distance itself does more to convey the Arctic climate of our family than any particular literary comparison. Meatballs. My parents seemed almost embarrassed by the fact of their marriage. There was no story, for example, of how they met. How did you meet Dad? Ring. Here we see a brutal depiction of Bruce returning home, his face contorted in mute shame for the lie he is purporting against his family. Bruce's reading list, at least as Allison records it, embodies the canon for literary modernism. The word canon comes, like so many of the words I've used in these lectures, from Greek. It initially meant rod or rule, but it developed to mean church law, or more definitively, a list of acceptable texts of the Bible. Without a doubt, the best definition of the canon that I know of is by a scholar named John Gulleroy, who writes in his book Cultural Capital, "In no classroom is the canon itself the object of study. Where does it appear, then? It would be better to say that the canon is an imaginary totality of works. No one has access to the canon as a totality. This fact is true in the trivial sense that no one ever reads every canonical work. No one can, because the works invoked as canonical change continually according to many different occasions of judgment or contestation." Two words stand out for me here. The first is imaginary totality. This is interesting to me because when I think of a canon, I don't think that it is imaginary at all. I think that it is real, that these are important authors who are important to read. Further, it's an interesting thought that this is an imaginary totality, that there is really no final list, that the list actually evolves as it is taught, and that it changes as new writers are added and old writers fall out of interest. That the canon is open-ended invites the next phrase I circle: change continually. What this suggests to me is that rather than fixed, the canon is open, evolving, changing, with generations of readers and teachers and scholars. It is the research mission of a university to work with this change, to authorize the literary canon as it develops, and this is what Alison Bechdel does in Fun Home. She begins to assemble her own reading list, her own imaginary totality of homosexual authors: Colette, Radcliffe Hall, Virginia Woolf, Rule, Tripp. Indeed, as Allison goes on, she discovers that homosexual women were very much part of literary modernism. The front matter of my modern library edition of James Joyce's Ulysses includes the decision by the judge who lifted the ban in 1933, along with a letter from Joyce to Random House detailing Ulysses' publication history to date. He mentions that Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap were prosecuted for running episodes in their magazine, The Little Review. He acknowledges the risk Sylvia Beach took in publishing a manuscript no one else would touch. Perhaps it is just a coincidence that these women, along with Sylvia's lover, Adrienne Monnier, who published the French edition of Ulysses, were all lesbians. You should learn about Paris in the 20s, that whole scene. But I like to think that they went to the mat for this book because they were lesbians, because they knew a thing or two about erotic truth. What is this connection between literature and erotic truth? I would say that it plays out not only in Alison's reading, but in her writing as well. Look to pages 170 and 171, where Alison Bechdel describes her first drawing. In fact, so certain was I of Enning's indecipherability that I used it 3 years later to camouflage an entirely different biological event. If only I had read Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray, I may have taken some comfort in the knowledge that the only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. Although I did not allude to masturbation in my diary until I was 16, I began the assiduous practice of that activity soon after I got my first period. I didn't know then that there was a word for the oddly gratifying motion of rocking back and forth in my chair as I drew at my desk. The new realization that I could illustrate my own fantasies filled me with an omnipotence that was in itself erotic. In the flat chests and slim hips of my surrogates, I found release from my own increasing burden of flesh. Nor did I know that there was a word for the inevitable result of the shifting about in my chair, the implosive spasm so staggeringly complete and perfect that for a few brief moments I could not question its inherent moral validity. When I accidentally ran across the word in the dictionary one day, it was instantly familiar before I even got to the definition. I didn't need to know phonetics to recognize the approximate liquid of that or, the plosive ga, the fricative z, or the labial nasal sigh of the final The word entered my vocabulary, but not my diary. A sin of omission? Perhaps. But if the thing omitted were itself a sin, it seemed to me, in another practical use of algebra, that a canceling out occurred. Here, Allison begins by talking about her problem with writing. She writes in a code for intimate issues, eventually even obscuring her writing with a mark, which she refers to as enning here. Writing is fundamentally alienated from meaning. This is not so for comics, which involve the body in an erotics of illustration. Her sexuality is a natural outgrowth of her drawing, rather than representation as an expression of the truth. The truth of her body, or of her sexuality, is seemingly an expression of her ability to represent. So, budding English major that she so clearly is, she looks up orgasm, a word that sounds like it is, liquid and explosive. It's an example of onomatopoeia. In a sense, that is what has occurred. The representation, the word, has fully matched the experience, mapping sound, physical feeling, and meaning onto one another with a rare perfection. This mapping is what Allison likes. It's what she did with Bruce's library, with the meatballs, and it's what she recalls about liking, about the wind and the willows. That the symbolic and the real line up perfectly, that comics label their images clearly, creating a map, a way out of the dilemma of narrative. So, if writing and photography are weakly linked to meaning, comics tighten this connection. What more can one say than comics sure are queer? But what does this mean to say that comics are queer? Allison looks the word up. She finds a number of definitions. Queer is at variance with what is usual or normal. And a little below that, queer is suspicious. Queer is not quite well, qualmish, or faint. More, it is to thwart, ruin, or put in a bad position. And below that, queer is counterfeit. Counterfeit leads us back to the beginning of the maze of Fun Home, a family tragicomedy, as if to define that feeling of falseness, that feeling of living a lie, that at any moment might turn around on you, knock you on the floor, to define that feeling as fundamental to one's body, within one's self. It is to label Bruce and Allison fake, suspicious, counterfeit, at a level that they cannot control. So in the page before us, Allison takes a belt to get over it, because these are all words that would deny her at a physical level. They are the authority of words, an authority she has had trouble with from the start, writing her as illegitimate. Fake, suspicious, counterfeit are all words that have been leveled at comics as well. But Allison's reading, her drawing has taught her otherwise. Her reading has taught her that being queer has examples, and that making comics art is fun. Physically fun. So I say that literature teaches us who we are by making us perceive ourselves outside of ourselves, even when the stakes are as great as they are personal. So I say that there is not a first person in comics autobiography, not because comics do not tell moving autobiographies, but because comics always represent the individual. Binky Brown as Justin Green, Artie Mouse as Art Spiegelman, little Alison Bechdel as Alison Bechdel, externally, outside the self. On a certain level, this is very sad, because it suggests that we are not within ourselves when we are within comics. On another level, however, I say it has a twofold consolation. First, it suggests that just as Allison created a queer canon of lesbian literary modernists, we have created a comics canon. At this point, it would include George Herriman, Winsor McKay, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, Bill Gaines, Al Feldstein and Harvey Kurtzman, Stan Lee, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, Will Eisner, Robert Crumb, Trina Robbins, Art Spiegelman, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, Frank Miller, and of course, Alison Bechdel. Indeed, comics readers created this canon. Somewhat late to the party, I've consecrated it by shaping this course, yet this course walks the line between the university's authority and the general reader's interest. It is a free course on the boundary of the academy. And so, one major conclusion we might draw is that comics show the current limits of academic authority because they are queer, because they are recognized as no longer a false, counterfeit mode of representation. Second, and more poignantly, this conclusion suggests something about literary creation. When Bruce Bechtel gives Alison a wall calendar to use as a diary, she doesn't know how to write in it. But Bruce, otherwise so foreboding and closeted and unengaged, gives her a simple piece of advice. Just write down what's happening. It's as simple as that. Just write it down. With this, I find much consolation, a way out of the labyrinth of ourselves and the definitions that would fix us before we were old enough to know that we are broken.